Hi everyone, welcome back to another update on the Kwyll development. Following up from the last video, which was a very short one because of returning from holiday, I've spent a little bit more time since and implemented a few features, so we've got a little bit more to see today. None of them particularly big, but hopefully most of them quite useful. Most of them have been requested by the testers. In fact, I think all of them have been requested in one way or another by the testers. Some of them were put on the list, but then bubbled to the top when they annoyed me enough to be worth doing sooner than I'd originally planned. But I'll go through each one in turn. I've got some notes, so I'll have to look through the notes to make sure I'm not missing any. I'll switch to the editor so you can see what we're doing. The first thing is a bit of a follow-up from the last video where I mentioned the portals and the markers. So I've had to make some changes to that, and that's finalised now and does work in the export and in the simulator. So I'll just load up the test that I use for that, which is the game 3. And show you how things have changed slightly. In fact, if I go to the rooms first, it's probably easier to see from there. So you'll see now the markers, which I've got a few in here to test a couple of different use cases, have now got a number associated with them. I'll probably change the rendering of that so they're a bit clearer later, but for now you see these numbers, and on the list over here, so there's an icon to indicate that it's a marker, not an object. They've got a number as well. Anyone who's seen the previous video will know that they used to have names, and the names were used to in the logic to define where to go. I had to change that when I started looking at export support, so that it's once we get onto the spectrum. And the reason being, if I go to the logic for the player that does this, you'll see over here we've got this set over here. So this is in response to a collision with a portal. So the player has collided with the portal, and what we do is we get the portal room out of the room number, the target room number out of the portal, and the marker number. Now the reason I couldn't do that as a name where I was before in the previous incarnation of this feature is that you don't necessarily know the room at the time you're exporting. So in this particular use case over here, I do. It's this room, in which means it's this room just defined here, which means I could have put the names in there in a list in a drop down, much like I do in various other places that would update as soon as you add or delete markers. But in the most common case, which is this one over here, the room is coming from somewhere else in the logic, so it's not known until runtime which room you're going to. So having a drop down or anything down here just wouldn't work. So I had before a text field where you could just type in the marker name and you had to know the marker name, and that worked fine in the simulator because I can do a named lookup in the simulator within Godot, no problem. Doing text string comparisons at runtime on the spectrum is very inefficient and not something you want to be doing too much of. So I took the decision to do away with names. I couldn't even I did look into the idea of mapping a name to an index. So on the spectrum side we had a list of markers in an indexed array, and the name was translated to an index during export. But again, that can't be done because we don't know which room, so we don't know which markers are available. So I've switched to indexes now, which makes it a lot easier. It does mean also that the portal can not only hold the room the target room that you're going to, but also the marker. So if I go to a room that has one of these portals, so this is a portal, we've got two variables in here now that we can change, the room number and the marker number, which means you can choose which marker. So a different portal could go to the same room to a different marker, etc. think that describes why. So basically, just show that it still works. I've also put another small test in. You might have seen in the code. So the room stuff works fine. It goes to the defined marker that the portal tells it to go to. And I've also put this up here, which was just a test that the transport to marker works within a room, with a room object, because obviously the player is a global object, it's a map level object that doesn't exist in any particular room, whereas this bubble here does exist in this room and needs to move to a marker. So I wanted to put a test in to make sure that moving in local coordinates within the room works. So if I've set the code up to detect a collision between the player and the bubble and just move it to another marker, which works, just shifts it over here. And if I go and hit it again, it does nothing new because it's already at marker 2. So it is actually moving it to marker 2, but it's already there, so it's not making any difference. So that's all operational now, and this works on the Spectrum side as well when exported. So that's markers ticked, at least markers in terms of the room markers. I do want to add markers to the map at some point, so we can put markers in here, but for now that does what it needs to do. So moving on to the next thing, this was a request from one of the testers. It was my birthday last week, and I basically pushed out a request to anyone on the testers group. If you want me to, I'm going to spend the day, my birthday, working on Kwyll. If there's anything you want done, get your requests in now. And this was one of the requests that came through. So I'll open up the scene so we can see the game. Now I've got this simple sprite and two states on and off. And if we go to the object and animation for flash, you can see I've set it up with the 2 frames flashing on and off, and it flashes here at the default rate in the editor, which is, I think, 10 frames. Every 10 frames it toggles. And I've got a second object which has the same animation but for a different use. So if we go to flash and look at the logic in flash, we'll see that all it's got is this always. There's a reason for this. It's a hangover from the way that the animation and the moving and everything works on the Spectrum side, which I'm hoping to do away with at some point in the future. But for now, if you're animating, if you've got animations, sprite animations on an object, and you're not moving it, so if it's not the player, for example, responding to input, or it's moving on a path or whatever, then the only way of getting it to redraw when the animation frame changes is to force a move at the moment. The cheapest way of doing that is to transport object, because it doesn't do any collision detection, so it's just basically moving. So this is every frame, move the object to the same position that it's currently at, and that just forces it to redraw if there's a change to the animation frame. This will be going at some point in the future, but for now that's what you must do. And the manual one is a little bit more, so it's got the same thing, just to make sure that the animation is updated. And then down here, I'm listening to the controller input, in particular the fire button, which is the spacebar. And so this controller is configured to return a 1 when the spacebar is pressed. So then we're doing a comparison to see if it is 1, and if it is, we set the animation with this animation node, which always existed, but the rate one was there but inoperative, and the frame one is new. So basically sets the animation to the chosen animation, which is, there's only 1 on here, and now we can set the rate and the frame to jump to. So when the spacebar is being held, this object will flash at a rate of 20, which is every 20 frames of redraw, it will flip to the next frame, the next animation frame. So it's not a speed, it's conversely, it's maybe a little bit confusing at first, but the higher the number you put into the rate, the slower it will animate, because it's basically a delay. Every frame through the game animation, through the game state, it will increment an internal counter, and when it hits this number, it will trigger a flip over to the next frame cycling round, and then reset the counter back to 0. So it's every 20 frames, every 20 runs through. And at 50 frames a second, which is what you'd hopefully be running at, that's obviously about 2.5 frames a second. So the reason for the -1 in the frame is I wanted a single node that allowed you to do all of this animation modification in one place rather than lots of little nodes. But there are cases, in this particular case, where you don't want to actually modify the frame, because what will happen is while you're pressing the spacebar, this will continue through this path every frame. And if every frame you'd set it, so if I put this to 0, if every frame you come in, you set the animation to 1 if it's not already 1, you set the rate to 20 if it's not already 20, and then you reset the frame to 0, the animation will never play, because obviously every frame through is just going to reset it back to 0. It'll never get anywhere. So I implemented a feature where if you specify a negative number in the frame, it just does nothing. It leaves the frame alone, which is what you want in that case. And in the case of the spacebar not being pressed, when you release it, it sets the rate to 0, which is effectively stopped. It doesn't animate at all, and sets the frame to 0 explicitly. So as soon as you release, it stops the play and resets the frame back to 0, whichever frame you happen to be on. I could have left that as -1, so it would leave it on the frame that you were on, but just to demonstrate how it works, I left that to 0. So if we go back to the room and look, we've now got these 3 instances of those objects. We've got a fast, a slow, and a manual one. So the manual one is the second type with the more complex logic. These two are both the automatic, just constantly running ones. Now, how you set the rate, the animation rate on these when you're not setting it through one of the logic nodes, is in the object properties dialog, where we edit all sorts of properties and details for the object. And there's this new line in here which is the default rate. So this one, the fast one, is at 2, so that's every 2 ticks it'll move to the next frame. So it's running at 25, it's animating at around 25 times a second, hence fast. And then in the slow one, it's the same thing, it's just set it to 10, so it's every 1/5 of a second it should run. So if we run that in the simulator now, you should see you've got this fast animator, the slow animator every 5 times a second, and the press fire one is doing nothing until I push the spacebar, which I'll do now, and you can see that it starts to animate at 2.5 times a second. And as soon as I let go, if I try and let go when it's lit, it'll automatically go back to 0 no matter where I let go, because that's what the logic's doing. So that's frame rate animation, animation frame rate, sorry. That should give some control to people designing animated characters and animating at different rates depending on what they're doing, and so on and so forth, and make that a little bit more friendly. So the next thing, moving on, was a very small one, but an interesting one. Yeah, I don't want to change this, save the changes. The move object node, so the transport object nodes have always, since they were created, always had an optional reference field. If I open up this one and go to our player, ignore all this, this is just the standard movement stuff, so it's the keyboard input and then move an object. This is what matters here. So the move object has never had, if I grab a transport object, you'll see it's always had this reference port which allows you to transport another object other than the one that you're on. The move object didn't have that, so I've added that. So now you can do move another object instead of just this current one. So what's happening here is the player's moving using the standard up, down, left and right. If it hits something, it'll follow through this flow, and the collided object, which is an output port on the move object, goes through to here. So instead of moving this object, it will move the object that you've collided with. and that goes through to here as well. So we're reading out the x, y, and position of the object that you've collided with, adding 10 to the y, and leaving x where it is. So every time you collide with thing, in fact anything, but the thing is the thing that it will collide with, it will move it up 10 pixels. So if I go to the room, you can see I've got a player and a thing, and if I preview, very simple, if I move around, if I hit it, it pushes the object away, so just by moving it. So that's just useful for having the moves or the transports and everything else affect another object based on various different conditions. So that was that one. And then another one which came from a request from the testers on Coffee on the Discord was the ability to modify a room's tiles and collision data at runtime for being able to make changes to tiles or collision and so on. So I've got a simple test that I put together for that one. We've got our character from the game 3 and a key as a different sheet with an 8x8 for a key. And if we go to the room and have a look at the room, you can see we've got a closed room with a door. Let me just turn off the collision so you can see a bit better. So we've got a closed room, we can't get out, with a door that's all blocking, so there's collision cells on every cell there, so you can't get out. And if we look at the objects, the player has the logic. So again, we've got the standard move over here, so don't worry too much about that. It's just the keyboard input going through the adds to move the object left, right, up and down. This is what's interesting here. So if we get a collision from the move and the type is type key, so I can check to see what type I've collided with, then we execute one of these monstrous nodes, which is quite big, quite complex, but quite powerful. And again, I wanted to try and make sure that I put as much into a single node as possible, so I didn't have lots of little nodes that do individual things. This went through more iterations than I care to remember. Each time I made a change to it, I realised that's not going to work, so I had to go back and refactor it again. And this is what I've settled on for now. It works in this instance. I'm hoping it's going to work for most cases. Time will tell. It can be modified if necessary. So I'll go through very quickly what each aspect of the node is. So this top section here defines the tiles that you're going to be modifying. So rather than modifying a single tile, which would mean you'd have to have either a loop, which we haven't currently got yet, or lots of these, I decided the best way to do it would be to enable the designer, the game designer, to modify a whole rectangle of tiles in one go, a rectangular space. So you've got a start position, x1, y1, and an end position, both inclusive. So working out these is actually quite simple, because if we go to the rooms editor, you'll see down here in cyan, in the white I've got the pixel position, in the cyan I've got the cell position, which is the tile grid. So I can just go to the door. The door's the thing I'm interested in here, and hover over the cell, which is 410, and that one, which is 512. So if we go back to the objects, 410, 512. So that's what I'm modifying. That's the area of the map that I'm going to be changing. The bottom half of the node is what to change, and there's a lot in here. So you can change the tile, and if you cycle through the available tiles from the tile map, it shows in the preview here which tile you're going to be changing to. Optionally, you can ignore that and just delete the tile, which is what I'm doing in this case, with a tick on there. And all of this column here, for all of these attributes, is ignore this. Don't modify this property when you're on any of the tiles in here. So you can just ignore the tile and leave it as it is. But in this case, we're going to be deleting the tile. The collision row is up the top, bottom, left and right, which are equivalents to these these flags here, it does allow you to input from an external node or an external calculation, and it's basically an integer value, which is the bitwise combination of 1, 2, 4 and 8 for the bits 1, 2, 4 and 8. And again, you've got the ignore if you don't want to do it. So in this case, because the ignore isn't set, we're going to be basically turning off the collision because we've set all of these to not enabled. So we're turning off the collision on each of the cells within this group. Ink and paper color I'm setting to black. You can change this, pop up, and it just chooses the standard colors. And again, you can ignore if you want to, and it just leave the ink and paper color as they are. For this case, I'm setting them to black. Bright, the bright attribute, I decided to pull that out. This is one of the things that went through a number of different iterations, and I eventually settled on having bright as its own row in the node. Excuse me, because I felt this was a potentially useful use of this tile, is to be able to toggle the brightness on and off on a bunch of tiles, maybe on a timer, so you get a flashing effect or something. So rather than have it included within the ink and paper color, which I did at one point, I broke it out so that it can have its own node port input. And that just basically sets or unsets the brightness. So in this case, we're setting the brightness to off, so it's not bright. And again, you can ignore. And then the final thing, once that'll do that modification on all the tiles in that square, that rectangle, and then it'll come through here and move the same object, which is the key, to 300, 300, which is just off screen. And that's because at the moment we have no way of hiding objects, so I'm just moving off screen so it disappears. So in theory, what should happen is if the player hits the key, it will delete the door and all of the collision, and then get rid of the key. So if we have a quick look in the simulator, so all of these are collidable. We can't get through the walls, we can't get through the door, and then if you go over and connect the key, the door disappears and you're free. That's a very simple example of how it might be used, but I'm sure the creative people creating games with this will come up with some interesting uses for that, moving things, changing the landscape, that sort of thing. I think that was the main thing. There was one other thing I added, which again it was requested in the by one of the testers. I originally added it to the list with a view to looking at it later, but then when I started doing the this one, and I want this particular sample, and I wanted the character in, I decided I'd go ahead and implement it. So what happens now is, what I've implemented now is, I didn't want to add too much to this toolbar. I wanted to keep it simple, so I've added a menu, which has just got the file menu at the moment. Load and save are exactly the same as before, as the equivalent icons here. But there's a new menu option, which is import. It's early stages. It's just doing what I wanted, what I needed at this particular time. But what it does is it allows you to choose an existing game. It'll list the tile set and any sprite sheets that are defined in there, with a plan to adding more in here for things like maybe rooms, maybe logic, objects, that sort of thing that you can import. If you click on any of these, it shows you the content, so you can see what you're going to be importing. So the tile set is all of those. The main sprite sheet is these, which is where I managed to import all of these quite easily into the sample. And then the sheet one is just a bullet. So if I just click that and the tile sheet, for example, it will import both of those. The tile set will add all of these tiles onto the end of any existing list of tiles that I've got in this game. The main sprite sheet will be imported as a new sprite sheet. I may in the future add some options to here to allow you to import just certain sprites, and maybe even to merge either the entire sheet or certain sprites into an existing sheet in your game, so you don't have a new sheet. But for now, this solves the problem. So we've just got those two. If I click on that, you can see we've now got the original main and the new one with our player in it. And if I go to the rooms, we've got all of the tiles that we had in that game already imported. So it just makes it really quickly if you're quick to get started. If you've got a previous project with some sprites or tiles that you want to reuse in a new project, you can bring them in and get going very quickly. So I think that's pretty much it at the moment. That's it for this update. Please do leave a like if you like what you're seeing. Pop over to the Discord, have a chat over there. I try and keep everyone up to date and keep everyone engaged over there. So if you want to come and make some suggestions, ask some questions, just chat, pop over, and always subscribe if you like what you're seeing, and you'll be kept informed as I produce more content. Thanks. I'll see you next time.